struck 2 o'clock. So I am excited for us to begin the first edition of the W.F. Mitchell Bioethics presentation for 2021. So to get us started, I would like to ask Lucina Hickey to bring some greetings from the Foundation.
I just want to make sure you can hear me okay. Mary, can you give me a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great. So once again, my name is Lucina Hickey. I am the CEO of St. Paul's Hospital Foundation. It's my pleasure to be with you, albeit at a distance, for this year's W.F. Mitchell Bioethics Seminar. So as a fundraising body for St. Paul's Hospital, we aim to raise funds that support initiatives for our staff and our hospitals and their professional development, their well-being, from a holistic sense, really. So one such initiative is the W.F. Mitchell Endowment. So this endowment is named in honor of a local business person named William Mitchell, known for his high moral and ethical standards and a strong interest in supporting community. So in memory of Mr. Mitchell, his wife Joanne established the W.F. Mitchell Endowment to support an annual bioethics seminar at St. Paul's Hospital to discuss topics of concern and interest that support the mission, vision, values of St. Paul's Hospital that would benefit the hospital and the patients that we serve. So I can say that with every level of confidence that both Bill and Joanne would be thrilled to see how we have worked to extend the conference beyond the walls of the hospital throughout the SHA to serve our frontline healthcare staff at a time when they need it most. Doing my best to keep my conference brief. I want to thank everyone for joining and to bid you well during this seminar and beyond. So I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lucina. So I have just a couple of announcements before I pass things off to Erin. The first one is you'll notice in the chat that we do have access to Erin's slides as well as a few resources that she has shared with us. So I've posted the link there. If you arrived just a couple minutes late, you might not be able to see the link, but I will post it again just in a few minutes to make sure everyone gets it. These resources will also be shared on the St. Paul's Hospital website, along with the video of this presentation. Sometime later this week, I'm hoping to get all of those things together. So the second announcement, today's session will be dealing with some pretty heavy topics for a lot of us. I think we've asked Erin not to shy away from some of the grief and the feelings that we've all been going through over the past 18 months. And so I wanted to let everyone know that if something does bubble up for you, if there's an experience or a set of emotions that come out today, we do have some support people on standby right now who are willing to meet with you in a breakout session. So if there is something that you feel like you would like to chat about and you would like to reach out to one of those people, please send me a private message. You'll find me in the drop-down menu as a host. So just look for Mary Howman, send me a message to let me know that you'd be interested in speaking with someone, and I will send you to a breakout session with one of our very helpful support persons. We have, I believe it is 4 people joining us from our spiritual care teams across Emmanuel Health, and 2 members of First Nations Métis Health Services for the Saskatchewan Health Authority who are joining us here today, who would be more than happy to reach out and provide a bit of support. So send me a message privately and I will make sure to connect you with one of those folks. All right, well, I think we're all ready for our guest of the hour. Erin, we can see your slide already up, but I would love to just pass it off to you to introduce yourself a little bit more and to put us in a good headspace to receive some of the information that we're hoping to receive today.
Okay, thanks, Mary. And yeah, thanks to all of you for taking time to join us today. I know time is very precious these days, as always, but I think more so today and these days than most of the time. So before I tell you a little bit more about me, I do just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis people. I'm in Saskatoon right now, and welcome to those who are joining us from other traditional territories. And so I ask us all to just sit for a moment and reflect on how we can, in the context of the conversation we're having today, understand and honor the truth and history of this land and build respectful relationships with the ancestors of this place, their descendants, and the land itself. And I'll be sort of referencing that as we go as well. The other thing, as Mary mentioned, this can be a bit intense, and there's I think folks have developed some interesting ways of coping with the intensity of how things have been, especially over the last year and a half or so. But given that I will be talking a bit about trauma, grief, loss, moral distress, um, just a reminder that you have control over how you engage today. And so monitor and check in with yourself. How am I doing? Is this feeling okay? Try to stay as grounded as you can. There's actually a great, in the link to the Dropbox that Mary's posted in the chat, there's a sheet of grounding techniques if you need some prompts for that. And remember, if you need to just leave, that's okay. If you need to reach out to Mary and ask for someone to just chat quickly, that's okay. And this is being recorded, so you can access it later. It's not going away, and so it will be here when you're ready to come back to it. If or just turn your camera off, do what you need to do to just sort of have this be a good experience. And remember, it's okay to connect within to our own coping capacity, but particularly to reach out if we need some of that support. And so the other thing I just wanted to do before we sort of dive into talking about this today, and this is a bit of a different practice for me. And so when I first began preparing for these sessions, I actually had a lot of anxiety. And as I speak a little bit more about myself and my experience, you'll come to maybe understand why. And I realized that I felt this real pull to start us from a place of acknowledging really what are we here for? Why? What brings us together? And to gather us together in a way that might be a little different than a typical talk. And so, before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge those who aren't able to join us and those who are here in this conversation. Let us gather our teams who are working today, those who are home getting much needed rest, healing from injury or illness, tending to loved ones, those who are off, unable to work, learners in our midst who are eager and scared and unsure, everyone in the healthcare field who came to work today, even when they really, really needed the day off, everyone who came to work today, even though they're not really sure they can do this, everyone who came to work today, even though they just aren't okay. Everyone who called in sick today because they just aren't okay. Everyone who answered a call to come in today or in the past, even when they weren't sure they could make it through another shift, another day, another second. Everyone who ignored those calls and then felt guilty or frustrated or fiercely protective of their time off. Everyone who is trying their best today. Those who are working harder than ever. Those who find themselves coasting to make it through. Those who are so tired. Those who are coping however they know how. The well-seasoned, perhaps a bit tough, even jaded, and wise. Those who are new to this work, maybe a bit naive sometimes, idealistic and hopeful. Those who are sad, have tears leak out when they're making supper or in the shower or on their way home from work, sometimes on their way to work and at work too. Those who are angry, who don't know where to put it, so it lands on colleagues, friends, family, or on ourselves. Those who are scared of how bad it will get, of how bad we might get, of how much they can handle, of how many will lose along the way, of who will lose along the way. Those who are trying to find ways to show they care in new ways, who miss being able to gather and express love and care through things like food or an embrace. By gathering, it's how we used to get through. Those who are just done with all of it. Those who still have some energy and maybe feel they have to hide or squash or mask it a bit, or maybe they're just rationing. We don't know how long we're going to have to keep doing this. Those who are curious, who need to learn and grow and unlearn and reflect as a way to cope with and get through this. Those who connect from a place of compassion and kindness whenever they can. Gather all of them here with us today. Invite them in. There's room for us all. We can do this. And so, with that, let's dive in. And so this session is going to explore a combination of things. And so it's a bit of a strange mashup, but strange times call for strange combinations of content. And so a few things just to think as we begin this. I'm going to explore these ideas around grief and loss, burnout, compassion fatigue, trauma, moral distress. And I ask you to be thinking about how this shows up in your work for you, how it shows up for your teams, particularly those of you who are in those leadership roles, right? So we are in, many of us have probably cringe every time we hear the phrase unprecedented times, but really, even the literature around how we understand all of these things is having to play catch up, because what these things look at like together is one thing. What they look like together during a pandemic that has now extended, and is pushing that 2-year mark is right in front of us, is something we do not in our lifetime, most of the time, don't have that experience, and therefore the knowledge that we turn to tends to need to do a bit of catch up. So one of the things to remember first is that, if you're feeling feelings of loss, anger, frustration, sadness, all of those things I talked about in the intro, if you're struggling with burnout, or folks on your team are really just trying to struggle to show up, these are all logical, reasonable, and normal or typical responses to illogical, unreasonable, abnormal situations. So when we think about what kind of context we've been in and are in, it is illogical, unreasonable, and abnormal, right? And it has been going on for so long. The risk is we start to see this as reasonable and normal. And that, I think, is a piece we need to all have on the radar. I'm sure many of you already have thought about it. Like, how do we not allow this to become the new normal? How do we not sort of settle into the distress, the conflict, the apathy, the frustration, the struggle? And so absolutely, just something to remember is that these are not disordered or otherwise problematic responses. There are brains and bodies doing exactly what they are supposed to do, which creates some challenges, though, in our work, because these are not things that we can fix. And so some of you may be a bit disappointed, or just like, damn, I hoped she was going to tell us, how do we fix this? And I don't think most of you are probably surprised by this, though, that really this combination of struggle and pain isn't something that we can just make go away, especially because it's that reasonable, rational, logical response to unreasonable, irrational, illogical experiences. And so as long as that context doesn't change, and we're not there yet, there will continue to be this struggle in our workplaces, in our communities, and in our families as well. And so we have to figure out, how do we carry this, all of this, without it reducing us to perhaps a worker we don't want to be, or a person we don't want to become. And that is not easy for any of us. And what it looks like to carry this looks different for each of us. So a bit about my background. I come to you, some of you know me already. I worked in Saskatchewan Health Authority until last December. One of the main factors in my decision to leave was I was not okay. I was struggling. The pandemic was very challenging for me. And I also struggled because I was out of frontline work, and I was actually, for some of my own health reasons, not able to just be redeployed into a frontline role in my field of social work. And so it was quite challenging to be someone who wanted to be out there doing the work and sort of holding back on that. And but the stress still gets to you, right? And so I know there are folks who are a combination in this group of frontline folks, people who are in leadership roles, people whose leadership role is still very close to the front line, and people who are a bit more removed from that. but I think it's important to acknowledge the impact on this sort of pandemic context on all of us, and to acknowledge that it is okay to say, I'm not a frontline worker and it still affects me. It can really be quite difficult, and it can certainly have a negative impact on our health, our relationships, our well-being. And so absolutely critical, I think, that we understand some basic ideas, so we have a bit of language to talk about what's going on around us and to support the folks who might need a bit of extra help, or just to have people feel seen and heard in their experience these days. So one of the things that I typically talk about quite a bit is trauma. That's how many of you probably, if you've seen me before, I'm often talking about trauma and trauma-informed practice. But the shorthand for me and the important messaging here around trauma is that any experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope can result in trauma. And so we know that this experience right now is overwhelming a lot of people's coping capacity, a lot. People within healthcare, people outside of healthcare. Our patients and families we're trying to support are overwhelmed, our healthcare providers are overwhelmed, and our system collectively is overwhelmed in terms of our capacity to cope. So when we have gone through and are continuing to go through something with the intensity, the duration, so the amount of time and the complexity of our experience in this pandemic, it has radically depleted and eroded that coping capacity. And so one reason we're more likely to see trauma popping up these days is because of that anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope can result in that trauma response. For those of us who have a trauma history, whether that came from earlier in life, maybe it was workplace acquired trauma, this means that we may be more likely to be triggered in our trauma, whether that's at work or at home, because our coping capacity is reduced, right? So coping capacity is a critical piece of this to keep sort of self-assessing our own coping capacity, because it's also not a fixed characteristic. It changes from day to day, from situation to situation. And so being able to have a sense of how we're coping, whether we have more left in the tank to help us keep coping, is really critical. If we're working with teams, it's really critical to be thinking not just about, who looks okay, who's showing up and, not calling in sick a lot, or is able to come in and take extra shifts, or seems to be doing fine, is really to look at, how do people cope? Do I know much about how my team copes when things, and often we do, we just don't think about it intentionally very often. And so I encourage you to do some self-reflection, but also to think about the folks you might be working alongside, and see, where do you think there could be room for some additional coping capacity? How might that shift things? And how do we acknowledge that sometimes there isn't a lot extra coping capacity we can just add? It's not like you can just tack that on to somebody and be like, here, cope differently. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So when we experience trauma, whether it's a triggering of historical trauma or past trauma, whether it's new trauma, and in many cases it's both, it may also be that we're experiencing what we call collective trauma, which is something that impacts an entire society or an entire group. And right now our world is experiencing what many have described as collective trauma through the pandemic. And we add alongside that the experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States around recovery of bodies from residential schools. We add in experiences around racism and systemic racism in particular, that has come to sort of the forefront. It was known, it's been known for a long time, but our awareness of it has changed in the last 18 months as well. So those are all experiences that can trigger trauma for folks too. So we are living in times that I often refer to as trauma saturated, where it is more likely that you are surrounded by people who have some experience of trauma than it is you don't. have those folks in your life. So I often say this is a great time to bring in our thinking from trauma-informed practice, which says use universal precautions. Assume trauma is all around you all the time and adjust your responses, your interactions, your expectations accordingly. That also means self-monitoring and assessing and saying, is my response in this situation maybe reflective of my own trauma stuff coming up in how I'm reacting to what's happening around me? So what happens when folks are in that space where trauma is more likely to be an ingredient in what's happening around us is people are prioritizing safety and protection over connection. And of course, we are in a context where the very nature of this pandemic has reinforced that pattern for folks, right? Where people are scared, there's things happening that we can't control. Our world does not look the way it usually looks for people, right? And so those are all signs to our nervous system to go on alert. And very often, that's exactly what's happening is people are coming into our facilities on alert. People are coming to work on alert. And our nervous systems are heightened often. And some people have probably been in that heightened nervous system state for months, right? And we are not designed to be in that state long term. That's supposed to be a temporary state that helps us stay alive in situations where our life is threatened or where we may be experiencing significant harm. And so when the threat is tough to see and name, or it's everywhere, that can be really challenging. So folks end up prioritizing safety and protection over connection, which we then see as maybe we see more conflict in our teams. People are less able to sit with difference and dissent and disagreement, right? Because they want to feel safe. And in order to go into a space where we're navigating conflict, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And often that requires us to feel a little bit unsafe. And those things may not be accessible to folks these days. So when we look at this, I'll go into this in a little more detail on this slide. So, and like Mary said, you do have access to my slide deck. You're welcome to use the content any way you would like. Feel free to share it with your teams. Don't need to ask me for permission. Just take it and go, print slides off, post them on your viz walls, do whatever you need. I don't want to make this any more onerous a process than it has to be. And so when it comes to trauma response, most of us are familiar with that fight and flight stuff, maybe even that freeze response. We now have a fourth one added into this that we call fawn, also referred to sometimes as tend and befriend, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what we see in that prioritizing patterns of protection over patterns of connection is people are more likely to go into those places where power and control helps them feel safe. So that's how we often talk about fight response. And these folks, that's not always bad, right? They may have a strong sense of justice and be quick to advocate for the needs of others, right? But they may be ready to fight, ready to, go to the mat. And that may not always be the most productive or the most helpful way to respond in a situation. That often folks, though, may have an edge of suspiciousness or defensiveness. We sometimes see, overt expressions of anger, rage, hostility. Sometimes folks just look agitated and unsettled, and it might be more subtle. Often what happens when we go into a trauma state, we are not actually accessing the executive functioning parts of our brain when we're in that acute trauma state. So we can't access reason, logic, decision-making capabilities. And so we often see folks have a variety of challenges when they're in trauma states around that, things that we expect people to do using their executive functioning or their sort of the front part of their brain. Their body has said, no, we need to prioritize survival functions. So we're working from brainstem stuff, not that more evolved parts of our brain. They need to be sort of silenced for now. We don't have time for that. We need to survive first. And then we can go to deliberating and reasoning and making decisions. So with fight response, we often see impulsivity, inability to wait, be patient, make decisions that are thoughtful, which you can imagine in healthcare type settings, that those are the decisions we make all the time. right? And so depending on someone's role, that can show up in really challenging ways. We also sometimes see folks go big physically in a fight response. They may widen their stance if you're with them in person, shoulders back, chest out, you know, that I'm big, don't mess with me look, right? This, I often call it the Superman pose, where it's the like, look how big and strong I am. It's a self-defensive pose, essentially. And so I often, when I was in direct practice, would look to that as one of the early warning signs people may be going into a fight response is this person getting ready to take me on or take someone in their environment? Sometimes it is their environment on. And often the challenge with something like a pandemic and the conditions resulting from it are that the enemy, the threat, is hard to see. So we find a proxy for that, right? We find something to be the threat. And it may be changes in our workplace. It may be our manager. It may be a coworker who does things differently. Those become threats that our brain and body may struggle to discern the difference between a life-threatening type of threat and something that is not life-threatening, but our brain is sort of overreacting to those situations because it's in that trauma space. Flight response. These are folks that, in all honesty, if you're in a flight response, one of the things you may do is literally leave, flee situations. And so keeping distance helps people feel safe. And so these folks may find one of the things they can control in terms of feeling safer in the world is not showing up, right? Just as we can choose to leave, we can choose not to go in the first place. And so we may see absenteeism from folks in a flight response. And so one of the things, you know, does that mean we just say, okay, cool, don't come to work today? No, it does mean though, when we have folks who are showing patterns, not once in a while, patterns, that maybe include absenteeism. How do we respond from a place that says, could this be trauma? Could it be that work does not feel safe to you right now, or the world does not feel safe to you right now? And one of the things you have control of is whether you go to work or not. And in the workplace, one of the only tools we give people to cope with trauma, mental health stuff, is often calling in sick days. It's one of the only tools that folks have access to on demand in the moment, right? Everything else they kind of have to wait, or there just isn't anything else in some cases. And so that is, you know, when you start seeing everything is a nail, you just use a hammer for all the things, right? And so being able to really think about that, sometimes people just kind of numb out, and they may be engaging in this more outside of work, but it can certainly impact our relationships, our sense of well-being, if we're doing a lot of avoidance or numbing type behavior, which can include substance use, food, gaming, scrolling meaninglessly. Some people call that doom scrolling these days, scrolling social media and just being constantly, I think, surrounded by some of the toughest parts of our world, some of the less appealing parts of our society, and it can often really feed that trauma response. Even when the intent of it is to try to make have some distance, it can inadvertently actually suck you back in. And then there are some folks who take this into a different direction, which is, I'm going to not be present in my world by striving for perfectionism or overachieving, overthinking, you know, just sort of constant pursuit of something else, something better. And usually it's trying to make ourselves better, which often is applauded and rewarded in this world. And certainly this has been huge for me to figure this out, that in a pandemic, we can't do a pandemic perfectly. We can't do anything perfectly, but in a pandemic, perfect doesn't exist. And we are often having to accept good enough, which for those of us who tend to lean towards perfectionism, that can be really, really actually almost physically painful, is this idea that we've lowered a standard. And our sort of way of fleeing the reality is by striving for an ideal that is often unattainable, but it keeps us disengaged from what the actual reality looks like. It keeps us sort of disconnected. Freeze, these are folks who find safety in, essentially shelter in place, stop and stay. So they may shut down, they may literally freeze in a response to a situation, which of course we know in many healthcare settings, especially direct practice, can create some safety issues in and of itself. But we also see folks show signs of things that we often see as depression, sleeping issues. That's partly because people just generally, their whole bodies actually slow down, and it may be they want to sleep all the time or they experience extreme fatigue. They may struggle to sleep at all. There may be a sense of disconnection, dissociation even. Sometimes folks reach that point of despondency. Nothing will make it better. I don't know why we try. There's no point. This is awful. And that can be particularly challenging. Often the key word for folks in a freeze response is stuck, right? People are stuck there. So I often imagine your feet in a block of ice or being sort of lodged in a big packed pile of snow, and you can't get out. You can't move without help. And typically that's that sense that I need a nudge, maybe a pull, sometimes come alongside and help me move out of here, because it can be very overwhelming. People can also get stuck emotionally and sort of show that flat affect, which is that very narrow range of emotional expression. And then also we see this impact decision making, where people may struggle with indecisiveness or inaction or a slowing of response time, which of course then again, when folks are in direct practice roles, that can be challenging. If you're in some of our support roles, that can be challenging because we often need to respond quickly. And then the fawn response. So these are folks who feel safe when they essentially forfeit all their own needs and it's all about other people. And these folks, I think historically have flown under the radar. This resonates very, very strongly with me and many helpers because part of the fawn response, that tend and befriend response, is caregiving. So it is probably not a surprise that there are some studies telling us that there are people with trauma histories who work in settings like healthcare. There's a large number who tend to fall into that fawn response when their trauma gets triggered, where they feel safer when they're caring for others than when the attention is on them. That may mean, though, these folks will avoid conflict. They don't want to speak out and be the center of attention. They may be very deferential or people pleasing, and their caregiving may go, sort of cross a line into their own detriment. It may mean they're not tending to their own needs. Often, of course, many of us have multiple caregiving roles in our lives, but being able to see when is caregiving actually maybe harming or being used as a way to separate from what's going on for a person. And so these folks may also physically try to go small. They don't want to take up too much space or inconvenience folks. So, they may have needs they don't want to tell their manager about, for example, because that would be drawing attention. So, as I mentioned earlier, once triggered in the brain, trauma ultimately trumps logic. It cuts us off from that logic center, that reason, executive functioning frontal lobe, and prioritizes all the resources go to the back to keep us alive and healthy and functioning. And sometimes when we have trauma history, that mechanism gets a little too sensitive and isn't sure how to read a situation properly and starts getting triggered more often or in situations where it's not needed. And that's where we see some issues happen. In and of itself, this response is actually exactly as it's supposed to be. That we don't have time when we're in a life-threatening situation to weigh out a whole bunch of options or spend a lot of time thinking about consequences of different decisions. We just need to make a decision and act almost without thought. And our brain does what it needs to basically force us to do that. So what happens then is people develop those adaptations to trauma that we saw in the previous slide. So what we know about folks with trauma that's not being acknowledged, that they don't have supports for, is that traumatized workers can be quite compromised in their ability to learn, think, manage change, and relate to others. So when we look at our workplaces, our teams, that can be a real challenge, is to be thinking about how might trauma be getting in the way of this person or our group's ability to learn with one another and from one another, to think critically, just make decisions in the moment, manage the changes that are almost nonstop these days, and to maintain relationship while we're doing that. And that seems like pretty basic stuff, but it can be incredibly complex and messy in environments like this. So I also wanted to touch on grief really quickly. One of the things that's interesting about this experience is, many of us have learned about grief through experience, through training, through reading, and many of us have come to understand that there isn't a set pattern of grief. Each person's grief is unique, each type of grief is unique. And often when we're grieving, it's because we've lost something we love, and that each love is unique. Our amount of love that we put into various parts of our life and various people in our world is as unique as we are. And so there are no stages or phases or steps that can capture all of the love and pain of human relationship, whether those relationships are with other humans or whether they're with other species, with land, with culture, with just connection, socialization, hobbies, all sorts of things. So just a reminder before we dive in a little bit to talking about grief, there's no stages of grief. And I think most people are like, yeah, that's very true. No stages. It's not something that is always linear, logical, and there is a connection to trauma actually in some forms of grief. And so one of the pieces that I've been thinking about a fair bit is, how does what we're experiencing now and what we have experienced as we've gone through this pandemic, how does it fit our understanding of grief? Because what we've lost, what we are losing still, doesn't really fit a lot of sort of mainstream understandings of grief and how we talk about it. So sometimes I think the other piece is we don't know really what we've lost yet. It's hard to name. We just have a feeling of loss. Maybe it comes as sadness or anger, or just frustration, or sometimes confusion and disorientation. So we just have the sense that something's missing, we're losing things. We might not even be able to put words to what those are. So one of the pieces, I did a version of this session with a nursing education day earlier in October. And one of the pieces that they really appreciated, it seemed, was this little bit of content about a particular type of grief we don't talk about a lot, and that's disenfranchised loss and grief. This is not a new idea. So this is when we have loss and the subsequent experience of grief that isn't or can't be socially sanctioned, openly acknowledged, or publicly mourned. And many of us have experienced this, perhaps not having the language to say, oh, that was disenfranchised loss. But this is where significant losses can be even more challenging to navigate, because there may be stigma attached or lack of social support that can accompany this type of grief. And so in the context of healthcare workers in a pandemic, we may see things like, it's too bad support staff can't be part of our virtual self-care day, right? Where it may be a sense for that person, that support staff member on a team, to feel that their grief isn't acknowledged, that if there's going to be some time on self-care day to acknowledge the impact of grief and loss, where does their grief go, right? It can be sometimes a relationship that's disenfranchised. It's not like your real family, you're just coworkers. So if you have a coworker who dies, who leaves their practice, who moves to another unit, who's on leave and you don't see them, or even who's on shift, but you can't engage with them the way you typically have in the past. Those things are loss. But we often create hierarchies of loss, right? That there's like real family loss, and then there's other things. And depending on the person, it may be that is your family. That person maybe knows you in a way that your own family does not. And so then there's the loss itself. And I think this we see most often with the pandemic is especially the loss relating to professional or roles. Isn't that what you signed up for? And that was the line that I think really resonated with lots of folks in that nursing session. Is I think sometimes there's a sense that people around us who don't work in health, who aren't experiencing this or haven't, cannot understand. And sometimes the response is, you know, what did you expect? And certainly that was one of my early career experiences pre-pandemic. Was I worked in HIV/AIDS work, and many people, when we'd experience loss, would say, well, what did you think was going to happen? You're working with people who are dying. That does not mean the loss is easier. But sometimes I think that's people's attempt to move through an awkward conversation, to say something when they don't know what else to say. Typically, I don't think folks are saying these things with intent to cause harm, but often the impact is just that, that people do not feel seen and heard, they do not feel validated in their experiences, and that there's a sense of dismissiveness to that, of minimizing the impact of it. The other thing is there's also in those hierarchies of loss been a lot of us have coped by saying, at least this hasn't happened to me yet. Or at least that person, you know, I can go home to my spouse. I don't have to leave my spouse at the hospital or communicate with my loved one through a tablet right now. And so we diminish our own feelings of grief and loss because they might not be as bad as some of what we see in our work or in our colleagues. And so we then minimize our own sense of loss by doing that sort of comparison with the losses of others. And the reality is loss is relative. And there is no hierarchy of grief and loss, just as there are no steps or you know, stages that we can turn to tell us what's going to happen and how it should look. So coming back then to this visual of the complex interplay of these things, I ask you to reflect on how this shows up in your teams and how it shows up in your work, and to be thinking about things that maybe have happened to you or that you've noticed in your workplaces and that could be understood, perhaps using some of these ideas to help us understand what this is about, what else could be happening here. And often it's tough to understand this for sure because even when asked, people may not have the language or the capacity to tell us what's really happening in them. They may not understand fully what is all going on. So we often have to go based off of sort of a hypothesis of what was that about? Could it have been about grief and loss? Could that have been about trauma? So we've talked about those two, and I'm going to carry on with some ideas to just help explain some of the other pieces. So burnout, we hear about a lot. There's been tons of conversation about, you know, COVID burnout, pandemic burnout in general. And we know that prior to this pandemic, burnout was already a consideration and a concern for folks working in healthcare. Burnout's not new. It's also not just the domain of healthcare. It happens in all sorts of professions. And so this burnout is really about expectations and expectation management. Ultimately, burnout happens gradually, typically over time, where our coping capacity, our resources, our sometimes our ability to think through situations, to reason, to be patient, gradually wears down, sometimes gets completely depleted, and it is typically about striving towards unrealistic expectations. And those may be our own expectations. So recovering perfectionist right here, lots of big unrealistic expectations, constant striving towards unrealistic expectations, especially when they're coming from within, pretty much is a prescription for burnout, right? It is going to happen and likely will continue to happen until there's some work done internally on that expectation, right? How do we change our own expectations? But often we work in settings where there's an external expectation that may be unattainable, unrealistic, and we keep striving towards it. And it may be, you know, a sense that we're seen as part of the problem if we can't achieve that, meet that expectation consistently. And so feeling powerless to achieve the goal or change the goal or make change in general and control our work certainly is one of the sort of feeders of burnout as well. And we see that it's showing up in terms of people having gradually, and sometimes it appears quite dramatically, reduced capacity to cope with demands of life and work, and all sorts of different pieces of that. So then we also often have been hearing about compassion fatigue. Again, this is not new to or unique to pandemic experience. We were talking about compassion fatigue prior to this. This has just been intensified, amplified, and really, I think, deeply entrenched in many people's experience these days. So this is about wanting to help or helping people. Sometimes it could be groups, communities, creatures, the environment, our world. And we see suffering, but we may eventually deplete our compassionate capacity. And so one of the nice things about compassion fatigue is there is a bit of a protective factor, a way to mitigate it, which is compassion satisfaction. So my suggestions for folks are looking at how we bolster things like satisfaction, because we can't necessarily stop the drain of, people need to keep sharing that compassion. That's what we're here for, right? We can't just stop being compassionate so we don't run out of it. And the reality is it's not a finite resource. It's that we run into situations where our ability to recharge, refuel, may be depleted because our access to compassion satisfaction has been impeded in some way. And so the fulfillment we get from helping others keeps us from experiencing compassion fatigue as often or as severely or as rapidly, and having positive collegial relationships. So in acute care settings where we haven't been able to do things like potlucks and Sunday bars and birthday parties, all of our teams have had those things set aside for so long that those are part of how we maintain and create positive collegial relationships, right? When we can't sit together in the lunchroom, we have to sit far apart, or there's a max of 2 people in there at a time, or 1 person in some units. That further erodes our ability to maintain and promote positive collegial relationships. Ultimately, we need to remember that also is eroding compassion satisfaction for folks. And this can be connected to experiences of vicarious trauma, which typically is when we aren't experiencing the trauma firsthand, we're walking alongside folks, sitting with people, hearing stories of their trauma. And that may be trauma due to what is happening in their life right now. It can also be historical trauma or past trauma. So with vicarious trauma, usually we see a big shift in the person who's experiencing it. Their worldview typically shifts in some noticeable way. So for me, when this happened, I typically am kind of a glass half full person, and it annoys the glass half empty people in my life greatly, because I tend to be an optimist. And looking at absolutely being able to figure out how do I see the world was important to being able to figure out what was going on with me. I reached a point where instead of being able to say, let's look at what's possible, I was starting to then shift to, nothing's possible. And it was quite noticeable because I was well known for being a, sort of an optimist, a glass half empty kind of person. All of a sudden I was like, why do we even try with this stuff? Like, there's no point. Like, we're not going to get anywhere. I don't know why. And people started being like, oh, where's your attitude coming from? What it was actually the sign that my worldview was shifting a bit because I had signs of trauma. And as someone who has a history of trauma prior to coming to this work, that was a significant warning sign. And unfortunately, at the time, I was unable to heed the warning. And I think many of us feel like we don't have the energy, the time, the coping capacity to slow down and watch for those signs. We may also notice them in others and not know how to say anything, right? How do you talk to folks, especially if they're struggling and maybe in a place where they're not themselves, they're not, able to really clearly see what's going on around them? It can become quite challenging. So the other thing that we've heard more about throughout the pandemic is moral distress. And this is when we know what's ethically right, but we feel or we are precluded from doing that. We aren't allowed to do what we know is the right thing to do. And so this is that ethical tension that, I mean, we navigate ethical issues often in practice and in our work worlds. But each time we experience moral distress, there can be residual moral distress that doesn't ever fully resolve or disappear. And the literature refers to that as moral residue, which is a very interesting term. But that over time, if people keep having to go to this place of moral distress, they don't ever fully resolve that, and they carry it with them, which can result in moral numbness. So that numbing or disconnection, which is where we see some of those intersections with trauma, right? And it can fuel burnout, compassion fatigue, and so on. But we do know, again, this is another thing, there's a protective factor here called moral courage, and that's where we may feel fear and act anyway. And this is often seen in settings where it's, you know, we stand up for what we know is the right thing or doing the right thing, even when there might be some negative repercussion. My sense is that we are now at that point in our health system right now where we are going to see this more often. And we know that's already here. And so how do we navigate and balance around moral distress? Some of the best responses to moral distress are acknowledging that it's real, rather than trying to rationalize, justify how no, this is the right thing to do, to just acknowledge, yes, we know. This would be the ethically right thing, or this is, you know, what's needed right now, and this is what we must do right now. And rather than trying to sort of smooth over that tension and maybe hide it a bit, bringing it out and actually being able to explore it and talk about it, and as much as we're able, help people find space to explore that for them. And that may have to be something that we do on our own a little bit in, you know, with support and community. So a couple last thoughts just before we sort of go and see if there's some questions or any comments is just when we talk about preventing trauma and this is from like a session I do actually for kids and youth, but what people need when they experience high distress environments in order to not develop long-term adverse effects from trauma is they need empathetic, compassionate, and affirming witnesses. So people to say, that was really hard. Are you okay? What do you need? How can I show up for you? Or just, do you need to just sit here and sit quietly with me? Do you want to be alone? But having people who actually acknowledge that there's some distress happening and it is logical that it would be affecting people, sometimes in quite strange ways. So okay. That affirmation. Then the piece is that for some folks, they're going to need support beyond that affirmation, right? They're going to need physical supports or emotional or social or cultural supports or spiritual support as well. And so what is our role as colleagues, as managers and directors in helping facilitate access to those supports? And often our response is, here's our EFAP program, you know, here's how you find a counselor. That's okay. It's not a bad thing to do, and I don't discourage people from doing it. However, sometimes that is not where people are at, or it might not be what they need. And so it's important to, if we are chatting with folks about supports, be broader in that conversation. Maybe people need to find more time to be outdoors, or maybe people need a break from work. Burnout, one of the sort of tests, is it burnout? Is it compassion fatigue? Is it trauma? Take a break from work. Do you feel better? Do things get better? And often if it resolves almost entirely by taking, you know, enough of a break, usually more than a week, then that's a sign it's burnout, which means it's tied to expectations in your workplace coming from you or coming from someone else. If it doesn't get better, if the stuff follows you out onto your break, chances are it's more, you know, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma stuff that may need some of these supports to really move through it. And then people need to bolster their coping strategies. They need tools, techniques, and additional capacity. So here's one piece to think about that might be useful for you or your teams is thinking about how you are coping now, right? And so that self-assessment, what do I turn to when I am really distressed, when I really don't know if I can get through this, or I just need to put my head down and get through? How do I do that? What do I do? And so often when we are assessing that, we may come up against our own judgment or the judgment of others about how healthy or appropriate our coping mechanisms are. So some of us, there's been studies coming out about increased rates of substance use among all sectors of society during the pandemic. That's a coping skill right there, right? And it's maybe not one that we all want to celebrate and jump up and down about and encourage people to adopt, but it is one. So this is about neutrality. Let's look at our coping from a place of neutrality and compassion for ourselves and others. So we don't just want to dump out the rocks in the jar if those are our coping strategies. We don't want to just toss them all out and start over. It leaves people without capacity. So how do we help people add rocks to the jar, right? So that they have a broader variety of things to maybe help them cope better in different situations and cope through more intense situations. The other thing is, this is also limited in terms of how much it can do. There's only so much coping capacity that a human can develop. We all reach a limit. So we also need to acknowledge that at some point that lid isn't going to fit on the jar anymore. And we just have to figure out how to carry this. So what can we do? And this is really directed towards leaders, but you can certainly take from that and translate to your own role. Actively work to have people feel seen and heard at work, at home, in the community, as much as you can. It doesn't just happen by accident that people feel truly seen and heard. And that in a trauma context, in a grief and loss context, is crucial. That people don't feel their response to this is somehow wrong or inconvenient or too uncomfortable. That we can certainly help support folks to be their best self at work, maybe to have hard conversations about whether they should be at work right now, and so on. But we can do all of those things by validating, affirming, and really seeing people for who they are, where they're at. Commit to transparency and authenticity. What are the limits? What can you do? What can you not do? What's the reality? So spelling it out, which is sometimes very uncomfortable, and acknowledging the limits on what we can be transparent about. Sometimes there are things we can't share yet or ever. And as leaders, that can be tough as well. Support broadening our own coping capacity, deepening that as well, and really encouraging that in others. And then promoting and facilitating access to those supports so that we're reducing the likelihood that this sustained experience is going to continue to cause harm to folks. So sit for a moment, take a breath. That was a lot. Yeah, questions, thoughts, comments? And you can type in the chat. You can go off mute if you want, like raise a hand and we'll call on you. If you have a comment, an example, a reaction, a thought you want to share.
So I noticed in the chat that Tracy Mugley, our executive director here at St. Paul's, just wrote a reminder that there was a study done with our staff here at St. Paul's and with the other Emmanuel Health facilities, where 92% of all respondents felt that they derived satisfaction from being able to help people. Yeah. That's such an important takeaway, especially during these times where we might feel like we're not helping our patients and their families the way that we want to kind of refocus our energies, try to help each other, try to find ways to find that compassion feels so important.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I do think that, like, if we know we are feeling a lack of that ability in our work, then being intentional, or if we see that in our teams, right? How can we be intentional about creating opportunities to show compassion and to experience compassion as well? I will just flag for folks that there are quite a few resources at the end of the slide deck. There's also some handouts in the Dropbox folder, so you are welcome to check those out. And I've included resources on a variety of topics, Mary's just added that Dropbox link back in the chat, so make sure you copy that and grab it before the end of the session. However, these resources will be on the St. Paul's Hospital website following the session, which is also where we'll post the recording link. So there's some really great stuff, some really lovely articles. If you're interested in disenfranchised grief, this article in the gray square is from the New York Times, and it's just lovely to read. I mean, it's very emotional, but it's a really interesting. It's not necessarily going to give you a lot of techniques to manage disenfranchised grief, but it certainly does give a nice exploration of it. There's also resources out there if you're struggling or someone in your teams are struggling, and I wanted to include those, including the Resilient Workplace resources on Saskatchewan.ca, the Healthcare Worker Mental Health Support Line, although limited in terms of the hours it's operating these days, is still there. And then the Suicide Prevention Service and the COVID Frontline Wellness site, which has also got some great stuff. And last but not least, if you would like to reach out to me, you're welcome to do that through email or Instagram. If there's anything I can do to support you, if you have questions or need a resource, I am happy to help out with that.
Wonderful. Well, I didn't see any hands go up. I'm seeing a few comments in the chat just thanking you, Erin, for such a wonderful presentation. I'll echo that as well. The resources look phenomenal. I'll be taking a look at those and posting them on the website. And so for anyone on the presentation, you can also reach out to me in the ethics office here at St. Paul's, and I will be happy to connect you to some more resources or back to Erin herself. So Erin, I feel like if we were in an auditorium together, this would be the perfect time for lots of applause, but it doesn't work so well over WebEx. So I hope you can hear that applause thundering around you. This was such a help. And for all the staff who are on the call today, oh, look at that. It does pop up. Everyone. There will be two more sessions geared towards a bit more of a general audience this Thursday and next Wednesday. Please reach out if you'd like the links to those presentations. I particularly hope that you'll share them with your teams so that anyone who can be available will be there too. All right. Well, thank you.
Mary, can I just jump in and remind people that next week is Ethics Week, and we have a slate of presentations, 2 presentations a day all next week. I believe the poster will be on the ethics webpage, and we invite everybody to attend those sessions. So
yes, absolutely.
I'm sorry to shoulder in, but I just wanted to plug our ethics week.
Everyone wants to make a plug for their own department, but this was an ethics presentation, so Melody's was the most appropriate.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Yes, take care, everyone. Take care, Erin. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye.